Thank you, folks who are on the phone with us today. This is, I don't even know now, maybe fifth in our ongoing series of webinars addressing team science and interdisciplinary collaboration. Today, we're delighted to have with us Michael O'Rourke, who is the Interim Director of the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity, as well as a Professor of Philosophy and faculty in the AgBioResearch and Environmental Science and Policy Department at MSU. He is also Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which I think many folks in these circles are probably familiar with. This is an NSF-sponsored research initiative that investigates philosophical approaches to facilitating interdisciplinary research. And Michael, I think I got to see you present at the last Science of Team Science meeting on this subject. It was a fascinating talk. Right. So during today's webinar, Michael will be sharing with us his thoughts on how to gather resources, data, and good arguments for investing in interdisciplinary research and its infrastructure, and in hiring and training capable staff. And Lord knows, anyone who's had to grapple with administration in a university setting, these arguments should be very helpful. So, Michael, with that, I'll turn the baton or microphone over to you, and
thank you.
Delighted to have you.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that. Hello, everyone. I am really delighted to have an opportunity to spend this time with you and talk a little bit about motivating investment in interdisciplinary infrastructure. This is a topic that has been on my mind for the last 2 decades, which is not to say that I'm necessarily going to say anything that deep in my remarks over the next half hour or so. I think a lot of what stands out about success in an interdisciplinary context is the sort of wisdom of common sense, but it's useful sometimes to have a bunch of that collected all up in one place. And so that's what I've tried to do with my remarks today. I start the talk with this question: what can one person do? And I want to, let's see, figure out, okay. I want to just answer that real quick. I think the answer to that question is probably not much, if anything at all, really, because it's never just one person. Even if you're doing interdisciplinary work on your own in your office, you're relying on the work of other people who contribute perspectives that you need to integrate in your work. Most of us, though, are engaged in collaborative processes and institutional contexts, and as a consequence, there's always a bunch of people involved in interdisciplinary effort, and its success depends upon a coordinated contribution from all of them. Today, what I'm going to do is collect reflections on my own experience in building interdisciplinary programs, so reflect back on 2 decades of attempts to create more interdisciplinarity around me than I found when I got there. But in talking about these reflections, I'm going to be sharing stories that really involve a lot of people and many people who are just as passionate about these things as I am. And these stories are really as much their stories as they are my stories. So I want to kind of emphasize that. And really the key to this success, any success that I've enjoyed in doing this work is really a reflection of the contributions that many of these people have made to the efforts, right? And I feel like in my case, what my career is sort of taken off in some ways when I discovered collaboration, right? The joy and the energy of collaborating with other people who have different perspectives and bring passion and energy to the project. It's before I began collaborating on as an academic, I was engaged in sort of lone wolf philosophy. Philosophy is kind of a lone wolf culture. So, it was really the integrative work of collaborative research and practice that I found to be an extraordinarily big boost to me as a professional. And so I kind of want to channel as much of that as I can today. here's a plan for the talk. That's the talk that's going to focus on my career in interdisciplinary program building. And I want to start off by talking just briefly about what it means to preface something by saying, in my experience. And then I'm going to provide a conceptual framework that, just a brief and pretty simple one, that I'll use to frame the description of several examples. This framework will involve initially describing what each example is, setting the context for it, and then talking about positive and negative lessons. And then I'll provide a summary at the end before Q&A. So here I am, and as Amanda mentioned, I have some administrative responsibilities as well as a normal sort of academic responsibilities at Michigan State. I was, prior to arriving at MSU in 2012, a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Idaho. I engage in research and teaching and service, all those things you expect of academics. My research focuses on science and team science, and in philosophy on philosophy, language, and communication. I like to think of myself as a philosopher who works on interdisciplinarity and also an interdisciplinarian who engages with projects philosophically. But it's important in kind of like introducing myself that I talk about my positionality. So this is what I meant about thinking a little bit about what it means to preface something by describing it as your experience. So I'm a white guy, a white man, and the efforts that I'm going to describe are efforts that have taken place over a period from when I was 32 to 54, and I am a faculty member, and I began doing this work as an assistant professor, and I'm currently a full professor, and so that sort of transition, professional transition, is a part of my positionality. I'm trained as a philosopher. I've done a lot of this work in STEM contexts, although not exclusively STEM contexts. And as a consequence, I think these characteristics bring with them certain privileges that figure into the background of my remarks. So they give me certain advantages and access to administrators and others that some may not share. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind when I talk about the examples. I'd really love to talk about translation and Q&A of some of the lessons I described into other contexts, or if there are difficulties or obstacles that arise for other folks in translating these lessons into their context, that would be really, I think, important to articulate in Q&A if you're interested. The conceptual framework that I want to rely on begins with a couple of promises, and these are two promises that I'm just quoting from the abstract for this webinar. I want to make sure that I follow through on the promises. So I'll talk a little bit about resources, data, and good arguments for doing this kind of work in an institutional context. And then I'd also like, as much as possible, to provide lessons that are not so contextually bound to the specific efforts that I've been engaged in, that they can't be ported over into other contexts and into other careers. And so I'll try to do what I can to generalize over my own experience in a way that hopefully people will find useful. And the main sort of point of our aspect dimension of the conceptual framework that I'll use is context, right? Recognizing that when you engage in interdisciplinary program building, if you're either in charge of or you're contributing to the development of interdisciplinary infrastructure, that you need to be mindful of the context within which you're operating. A particular distinction that I like to use in thinking about context involves distinguishing between what you can control in a given context. So for example, you might be able to control your objectives and to some extent the initial conditions that you engineer in and put into place for the project that you're working on. You need to distinguish that from what you can't control. So examples of that might include institutional mission or decision-making that bears on your work but is made by people at quite some remove from you and over whom you have no influence. There are a whole bunch of other factors that typically bear on this kind of work that you don't have any control over. it's good to know, at least good to think up front about the elements that you do have some influence over and the elements that you don't have influence over. Try to keep those in mind, because the resources data and the good arguments that I'd like to kind of gesture at today really look very different in different contexts. I'll try to kind of illustrate that a little bit with my examples. So the first example that I'll talk about is Malcolm Renfrew Interdisciplinary Colloquium. This is a colloquium series that has been long running at the University of Idaho, a series that I had a hand in creating back in 2000. It's still going this year, and I left in fall of 2012, but it's still going strong. The context of this particular series involved attempting to build something that we could use to generate more substantial and wide-ranging conversation about interdisciplinarity at University of Idaho. University of Idaho is a remarkably interdisciplinary place, and it's but a lot of the conversations that were interdisciplinary in character were happening in distributed fashion, and we thought we'd try to pull them all together into one context, and that could be valuable for those of us who are interested in the topic. In doing that, we wanted to contribute to the intellectual culture of the U of I, and also just enable people to get to know what cool stuff was happening at the University of Idaho, and give people an opportunity to talk about their own work. Now, we started this colloquium series in the context of a humanities fellows program that was quite well funded by the College of Arts and Sciences there, and also the NEH. But what I'm going to focus on is the series that we continued to organize and run after the funding dried up. So we pushed out from that humanities fellows program into a space where we had no funding at all, but we still wanted to keep the colloquium series running. We realized pretty quickly that we couldn't control who shows up at these things, especially early, before anybody really knew about what it was or what, how cool it could be. So it was pretty sparsely attended at first. And then there was also just recognizing that running colloquium series is not really going to provide you with a lot of reward as an academic. Maybe in some of the roles there would be more reward forthcoming for this kind of thing, but for us there was very little credit we got for doing it, aside from the occasional pat on the back from people who enjoyed the series. Now, the lessons that I've taken from this, I think I learned quite a lot in my work on that. I'm just to focus on a few, positive and negative. The first one involves this notion of scaling up. We wanted to build this in a way that involved, as much as possible, over-determining its success from the start. So we started at a relatively small scale that we were confident could be successful, and then as it began to work and gain a little bit of momentum, we grew it, expanded it, and leveraged its success to gain investment. But the key for us was to really kind of over-determine its success at the beginning, so that we could really stick the landing with it, and then move out in a bigger way. The second positive lesson involves being consistent and reliable. Interdisciplinary work's really difficult, and if you're engaged in it at an institution of any size, it's likely going to be the case that you're going to run into the problem of just not knowing who's out there, who's out there that has the expertise or the perspective that you're interested in. We hope to create a series that could serve as a kind of coordinating hub for interdisciplinary activity at University of Idaho. But to do that, we felt we needed to be a consistent, sort of stable part of the university landscape. So we made a decision to locate the series on a particular day at a particular time in a particular location. So we did our research. We tried to identify just what the competition was over the course of a week, so that we could locate a time that was relatively free, and we picked that time. It was a Tuesday at 12:30, and we picked a location that was somewhat central, and we just said, well, as long as we're going to do this, it's going to be at this time in this place. And so that way people, as they came to know about it, would know where to go and when to go there. So I think that had a big hand in helping us build an audience. People began to plan around the colloquium series. So in futures, initially they maybe couldn't because of a class or something, but then they would plan their classes around this so that they could come. The third lesson that I want to kind of emphasize is this important one for people engaged in interdisciplinary work, and that's be ecumenical in how you understand interdisciplinarity when you're putting together a program like this. There are a lot of different ways of thinking about interdisciplinary work that you'll encounter, especially in a university setting. And while it's certainly, legitimate, I think, to some extent, to commit to a particular way of thinking about interdisciplinarity, one that's grounded in, the theoretical contributions of people like Julie Klein and others, and that would be totally legit thing to do. But it has the effect, I think, in the context of program building like this, of disenfranchising folks who kind of might think of themselves as engaged in some sort of interdisciplinary work, but maybe not in a way that fits a particular profile you commit to. So to avoid that, what I would recommend is being ecumenical, just sort of allowing interdisciplinarity as a term to cover combination of perspectives in a lot of different forms. So this Big Ten approach can be really helpful, I think, in building your audience and in building the number of collaborators that you have a chance to work with. On the negative side, there's this issue of a responsibility creep that, especially when it comes to your team, the team of people who are putting something together, it's good to be clear about division of responsibilities up front so that you can ensure equity over time. If you're not really careful about that and you just assume that things are going to work out because everybody approaches this, with good intentions and goodwill, you might find that, in fact, things wind up being unequitable. But not because anybody's at fault, or but just because of the way things work. So it's good to try to be as clear and about that as you can at the beginning. The other concern, this is sort of the downside of being ecumenical about interdisciplinarity, is what you might call buzzword backlash. Right? Interdisciplinary and its cognates are regarded by many as a buzzword. So who doesn't like, what administrator doesn't like interdisciplinarity, right? And if you are a big tent person about this in a project that you run, you do risk sending the message that anything counts as interdisciplinary. So you need to kind of maybe strike a balance, be thoughtful about striking a balance between being open to a wide range of different modes of combination, but also, making sure that the word remains meaningful as you use it in the context of your project. The second example that I want to talk about is a conference that I had a hand in creating and co-organizing, and a book series that I co-edited. This conference also took place at University of Idaho. It's Inland Northwest Philosophy Conference, co-sponsored by University of Idaho and Washington State University. It's a interdisciplinary conference on philosophical themes. It got started in 1998 and is still running, still going. And in conjunction with that, we also created a book series, Topics in Contemporary Philosophy, which is a series that was published by MIT Press, and it highlighted exceptional papers that were delivered at the various conferences, and each volume was organized around a conference theme. Now, our objectives in building the conference and a companion book series involved bringing a philosophy conference to us, for a variety of reasons, young families and so forth. We didn't have a lot of time to travel, and as a consequence, we wanted to sort of bring people to the Palouse, and so we'd have a relatively substantial opportunity to engage in philosophical conversation. We also wanted to highlight the interdisciplinary dimensions of what is perhaps for those of you outside of philosophy, a surprisingly disciplinary community. You'd think philosophy might be pretty interdisciplinary, given that there are philosophers of science and philosophers of math and, philosophers of language and so forth. But it turns out that actually philosophers tend to just talk to each other and go to conferences that are philosophy conferences. And so it's not as interdisciplinary as you might imagine. And we wanted to try to do something about that with this conference. And finally, we wanted to engage in public outreach. So we had a public forum that we ran in conjunction with each one of these meetings. The initial conditions of this involved very little money. We had very few resources at the beginning. Also, the Palouse, if you've never been there, you should totally go. It's an amazing place, but it's extraordinarily hard to get to, and so that was a challenge. And there was also at first we had a reading group. We just decided to bring some of our friends and others who were interested in the topic of that reading group to our campuses for a conference, and it turned out that we liked that so much that we decided to create a series and just keep doing it as long as it was fun. But that has an upside and a downside, which I'll talk about in a second. Again, level of interest is not something you can really control, and both on campus and off. Once again, lack of professional reward for running conferences, just like running colloquium series. You need to be mindful of whether or not something which you might be passionate about is actually going to help you. And then there's another thing it's hard to control is the level of commitment to the project of those on whom you depend. Like for instance, publishers at presses and so forth, right? So, everybody's busy, busier now than ever, and but you can't really control the commitment or level of interest that other people have in the projects that are top priority for you. Now, the lessons that I want to emphasize out of this include the value of diversifying. So we worked hard to create cross-functional networks that supported our efforts. We built a public forum on top as a part of the conference. We worked with MIT Press to create a book series. So that basically wanted to try to create a synergistic set of efforts that would allow us to be successful in initially in running this conference. So I think in general, maybe it's helpful to think about ways in which you might diversify that could support your initial effort. This is related, as I just mentioned, to creating synergies, right? So thinking about how you can take what you're doing and expanding it out in ways that allow you to meet other expectations or pursue other career goals. So as I mentioned, you don't really get a lot of credit as an academic for running conferences. You do get credit for editing books, though. And so we decided that what we had tried to do is create a book series that allowed us to get editing credit for the work that we were doing at the philosophy conference. Turns out we were doing this every single year, which, looking back on it was pretty crazy, but the synergy is really helpful. The book series helped us generate interest in the conference, and the conference helped us generate interest in the book series. It's also good to involve external communities in your work. So, you might have an institutional context for your work, but if there are ways of building out to broader communities, there will likely be people who are interested in what you're doing. If you can run meetings, workshops, public talks that get the word out to the outlying region, that can be really helpful. People will talk to your boss. We'll talk to the people who might be controlling the budget and talk about how much fun they had at the thing that you organized. That can't hurt you, believe me. I've had that happen with this series, this conference series. Having external parties enjoy themselves in the context of something you organize can be a real boost to the work that you're doing. On the negative side, there's the curse of success. These worked out much better than we would have imagined at the beginning. But again, that meant a lot of work every single year. I guess there are worse things, I suppose. The other thing to keep in mind is, where is the interdisciplinarity, right? So here too, you get the sort of buzzword backlash problem where it might seem like interdisciplinarity just gets lost in the shuffle, right? That that anything counts as interdisciplinary. But the conferences, they were interdisciplinary conferences on philosophical themes. Generally speaking, philosophers came, and as I mentioned, the philosophers tend not to be very interdisciplinary, so it was a struggle at times to keep the interdisciplinarity alive in the context of this conference. That's another thing to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of work. The third example is the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which Amanda mentioned. This is an NSF-sponsored effort that runs dialogue-based workshops and conducts research on collaborative cross-disciplinary work. So research is kind of meta-research on collaborative cross-disciplinary work. We began at the University of Idaho in a context of an IGRT project, an NSF-sponsored integrative graduate education and research traineeship project, focused on helping graduate students be successful in that project. That was our initial focus. But over time, we expanded that to move out in the direction of enhancing communication and collaboration and cross-disciplinary interprofessional projects more generally, not just graduate student projects, but projects all over the professional map. And in addition to the sort of outreach effort of facilitating cross-disciplinary research and practice, we were also interested in doing research on that very effort. So we're hoping, and we've worked hard to contribute to interdisciplinary theory and the philosophy of interdisciplinarity as we've conducted the over 250 workshops now that we've run around the world. The IGRT project was an important initial condition for us. Graduate education, we were working with new researchers who were teamed up, who had to produce interdisciplinary research at a high level. They got together in the context of a seminar that I co-taught, and everybody was interested in creating a pragmatic tool. So the toolbox approach really emerged out of work that graduate students were doing in this IGRT project. Those of us who continued to work on it were interested in exploring its applicability and impact beyond that particular context. Now, once again, level of interest is in the work is hard to control. There's a specific kind of interest that's especially difficult to control in this when you're doing integrating process-focused work in an interdisciplinary context. That's just level of interest in process. If you're working with academics or anyone else who's incentivized to produce deliverables, so articles or grant proposals or what have you, then you're gonna run into the situation where if you ask for some of their time to attend to the process of interdisciplinary work, they're going to give you a blank stare in response and identify as quickly as possible ways of stopping talking to you. We're not incentivized as academics to focus on process. We don't put that on our CV. We put articles on our CV, presentations, funded proposals, not workshops that we run typically, or workshops that we participate in typically. So it's tough sometimes to get the kind of buy-in from individuals who participate in the workshops. We also don't have any control over the history of a group we work with or its previous interactions with one another or with facilitators. So a bunch of different things, variables that are going to matter to the success of the work that you won't have control over. There are a number of lessons here as well. One thing that I think we've learned is the value of this sort of yes and attitude, the attitude that's emphasized in improv, right, where you take what people give you and build with it. This kind of work can come with all sorts of unexpected surprises, and if you regard those surprises as opportunities and as much as possible and not problems, then that's going to, it's going to, I think, allow you to live a happier life, and B, I think it might put your project in a position to be even more successful than it would otherwise be. It's good to build from strength. So sometimes like with sports teams, coaches will have systems that they want to impose, and they'll impose it on whatever set of players they have, regardless of whether or not the players' talents are a good fit for that system. I think that's a bad idea in the context of an athletic team. I think it's also a bad idea in the context of an interdisciplinary team, right? So identifying the strengths of your team and then modifying the objectives that you want to achieve in light of the strengths that you have is, in my opinion, a wise way to proceed. This may be obvious, but it's really important. And as obvious as it is, I didn't really necessarily see it when we started this. So take that for what it's worth. But tell a database story, collect data from the start in order to be able to tell the story of your project to other people. You're excited about it. You need to get other people excited about it. And data will help you do that. Even anecdotal data or testimonials can be remarkably helpful. We're trying to do a sort of evidence-based storytelling in the context of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. So we're doing rigorous social science, but that's not necessary, I don't think, to put yourself in a position to tell a winning story, a compelling story about the work that you do. On the negative side, it's a really good idea, again, up front, to, as much as possible, think about, kind of balance the idea of working with what you have with the idea of really pursuing the objectives you're passionate about. Thinking about those objectives, try to work out what you're going to need to achieve them, and do what you can to create initial conditions in which those types of expertise are represented. Right, so getting the right people on board as early as possible is a good idea. I can say in the context of this project, I don't think we really had a very clear idea about what we would need, because we didn't really know where we were going. So a lot of the clarity about objectives for us emerged over time. But certainly in retrospect, it would have been very, very helpful to have more social scientists in the mix earlier on than we did. And don't operate in a vacuum, right? It's almost certainly going to be the case that the ideas that you have are innovative to some extent. But they may be ideas that overlap with other ideas that have been implemented at your institution or other institutions. It's good to just start a conversation with people, spend some time at the Team Science Toolkit, looking around to see what other people are working on, and find folks to talk to about this so that you can learn about how to do the work that you're doing better. I mean, one of the cool things, in my opinion, about interdisciplinarity, one of the things that makes it so exciting is that you get a chance to be a student, sort of professional. And in order to do that, it's important to kind of put yourself in a position to continue learning, and even like coming up with ideas that you then implement as a project leader represent opportunities for you to learn from other people about cool new ways to do things. Finally, I want to talk about the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity. This is a brand new research center at MSU based in the College of Arts and Letters with the Department of Philosophy as its intellectual sponsor. The objectives we have for this involve serving as a hub for facilitating interdisciplinary research that involves humanists and artists as partners. So we want to really kind of focus on creating interdisciplinary projects that involve in an integral way the arts and humanities. We also want to support interdisciplinary research and graduate education. We begin this effort with a great deal of support from our college, financial and administrative support. They're very excited about this. However, there is some confusion in the college among faculty about exactly what we're doing, right? So, and this is confusion that we're doing our best to identify and address through a serious strategic planning process. So that's been an initial condition for us, is just trying to make sure that we have the community that we need to have in support of our work. Once again, level of interest is hard to control, both at MSU and beyond, and we can't be, we are not in a position at this point, given our funding streams, to be certain of the availability of future resources. So we have to kind of operate in a way that provides us with funding that we can use to support our activities. Sort of like work to create sort of budgetary redundancy as much as possible. Now, we haven't been around that long, just a few months, but already we feel like we've learned a few things. It's good to be opportunistic and be open to the possibility that success may look different than you thought it would when you got started at something. This kind of goes back to the idea of being a yes and person, right? Just you're operating in a context that's dynamic and upon which you are going to depend. If it turns out that your initial sort of thoughts about what would be successful in that context don't prove to be completely accurate, be open to modifying them and taking chance of the opportunities that come your way. It's good to leverage existing resources, so retasking things that have worked for you in other contexts in your new context, so great thing to do. I have a really wonderful team, Dr. Stephanie Vasco, Dr. Mercer Rinkus, who are part of the TDI effort, an important part of that, who joined me in the center and who are, the three of us form the group that's really trying to make this center a success at MSU. So human resources, it's important to leverage other resources that you have access to in order to support your work. And also, think big, it seems to me. Why not, right? Don't sort of blinker yourself or limit yourself out of the gate anyway. We're hoping that this becomes not just a coordinating hub for interdisciplinary research at MSU, but also maybe a national and internationally prominent center for kind of introducing or fostering interdisciplinary research that involves the arts and humanities as partners, as full-fledged partners. So I encourage you to think big. On the downside so far, this is a project. This is a center that basically didn't exist in July and then existed in August. So there was no there. Lots of expectations, but few clear benchmarks for success. It's good to recognize that when that's true and do what you can to work with, especially the people you report to put down on paper what those benchmarks are. And don't reinvent the square wheel. So, you want to talk to people who know the culture you're operating in. We're at a big university, and I've spent quite a bit of time talking to, as a Stephanie, managing director of the center, talking to other people who are running centers at MSU to learn about what works and what doesn't work in this particular culture. And the other thing is, you're going to probably, especially for us, we've been TDI, now we're the C4I, and we have to learn to work with former partners in new contexts and relationships. All right, so summary. If you're interested in building interdisciplinary infrastructure, success gets noticed. So, if you're successful, it will get noticed, but you won't be faulted for helping that process along. So Stephanie in our team is the very forward-thinking person who is helping us with social media. So taking advantage of that is a good thing. But also building your project out, involving community members and others and various activities you run can help get the success noticed and can help your project move forward. Fit the project to your organization's mission, but demonstrate how the mission can expand. So don't allow yourself to be, as much as possible, of course, don't allow yourself to be limited by the mission. Work to leverage the success you enjoy to help expand the mission in ways that are going to be conducive to even greater success in the future. Create partnerships, not just horizontal partnerships among collaborators, but also vertical partnerships with other units at your institution, maybe administrators or vice president of research offices or things like this, to aid in the identification of resources. Collect data as early as possible so that you can tell your story. Remember IRB if you're collecting data that you want to use to support some research storytelling in the form of presentations and publications. Also be persistent and observant. Find others who blaze this trail and partner with them as much as possible. Now, I'll end with 3 caveats. First, the programs I've described, the 4 of them are all new. And it's high risk, high reward to start a new project. It can be extraordinarily rewarding, but if it doesn't work, then that can compromise you going forward. If you inherit a project and you don't launch it, then the lessons that I've articulated may not necessarily apply, at least all of them. Some of them will, I think, but there will be other lessons that you can learn. I'd love to, in Q&A, if there are observations from the perspective of people who've been involved in running or supporting inherited projects. I'd love to hear about those stories. And finally, Idaho and Michigan State are really remarkably interdisciplinary places. They're very forward-thinking when it comes to fostering interdisciplinary work. So it's important to acknowledge that. It would have been harder to do this, any one of these things, in a context that was, where there was animosity toward interdisciplinarity. I have a lot of people to acknowledge. I don't think this list is comprehensive, but there are definitely people who were every bit as big a part of making these things work as I was. Here are a few of them. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And I think I'm happy to take questions, although I hope I can.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Are there questions?
They don't have to be questions. They could be comments too, right? I mean, the people on this call who are also very experienced in this. I mean, if there are alternative perspectives on some of the lessons that I've identified, I'd love to hear those too.
Well, I do have a comment, and Amanda and I are just exchanging a couple of emails here about actually how important some of the advice you have is just for the production of these webinars is very helpful. And I'm sure a lot of the advice that you've given is going to be helpful on many other fronts. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, the more you do along these lines, the more, the bigger your network becomes, the more people you know, the more people you can kind of pull together to pursue new ideas and new opportunities, new funding streams, perhaps for projects that are up and running. I think there's, I think this kind of work is extraordinarily exciting, and you know, there are a lot of people out there who are going to be as excited as you are. And if you're open to building and maintaining these kinds of networks, it should be, you know, conducive to success going forward. Which is to say, not to say that it's always going to be successful, of course, but.
So speaking of our network, which at this point in time, as far as people who are connected with Intereach is concerned, we have more than 200 people who are on our listserv, and we're trying to encourage more and more for them to communicate via the listserv, and for more of them to, if possible, present as you have today. How could we kind of encourage that more than we've done already? I mean, we essentially don't have a live audience that comes together. We can find a point in campus for everybody to gather, but so how do we get that same feel? You know, we're in disparate parts of the world and the country. How do we get that feel online? How do we connect and get an identity and a sense of purpose? What would be our...
That's good. I know that Intereach has had a presence at the Science of Team Science conference in the context of, you know, like a workshop on the workshop day for members of this community. I think that's a really good vehicle, right? It allows people to meet face to face, which, you know, is going to help build. It's going to help, I think, make the virtual interactions more meaningful. It might be useful to think if the look of Science of Team Science is the right meeting, maybe having a kind of companion, not just a workshop, right, which is open to everyone, but like a companion meeting that either takes place the day before or takes place the day after, the same location, that's really focused on the work of Intereach, and really focused on not just providing kind of workshop opportunities for people who are new to this, but presentation and other kinds of interactive possibilities that allow folks who've been engaged in the work at for some time to share their insights and experiences. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that having some sort of companion meeting that takes advantage of the fact that you're already connected to this group could be really valuable. There are probably other ideas too, but I don't know. I guess I just feel like if there's an annual face-to-face opportunity, then that could be that could really help increase participation in the virtual inter meetings that you have.
That was more of just us versus
right.
versus new people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the nice thing about having it at Science Team Science is that I think there are people in that broader community who are interested and who may not have heard of Intereach yet, right? So I'm betting that your numbers, your roster of participants has increased after the Science Team Science workshops, and you know, so there are people at these meetings who would be interested in what you do. And so you might add them to that you know, day-long Intereach experience as well. But yeah, just give the folks who've already committed to this and who devoted, you know, a few hours over the course of the year to these webinars, a chance to get together and share best practices or share insights, talk about obstacles. You know, yeah, I think I would encourage moving off in that direction, seems to me.
I think we did get a big burst of signups right after the meeting last summer. So you're correct. It is a good vehicle to get participation on the listserv as well.
Michael, I have a question.
Sure.
This is Jennifer Davison at University of Washington.
Hi, Jennifer.
Thank you for this great webinar. I'm hoping, well, I have 3 questions. One of them is, can we get your slides?
Sure. I would be happy to. I'm happy to send them to you. Okay,
awesome. And so the 4 different examples that you provided almost seem like a timeline of scaling up this work. But was that your intention, or do you find that it was useful to first start with the colloquium series and then move on to a conference and then actually to TDI, and then it led kind of to the center, or do you think that's not necessarily the case?
I'm going to begin my response by thanking you for giving me that much credit. Right, the idea that somehow this would all be designed. I mean, the reality is that my whole career, at least in the interdisciplinary context, is just one big accident. That, you know, I started off with the philosophy conference, and then the interdisciplinary colloquium opportunity arose, and you know, I love doing interdisciplinary work, and I have a hard time saying no. Those two have conspired to, in my case, to create an interdisciplinary career out of a philosopher who was trained in a pretty disciplinary way. I do, you know, that said, I do think that there are some interesting sort of patterns here, right there. At least right now, the center that we're working on, that Marissa and Stephanie and I are working on, is focused primarily internally on doing what we can to build our profile at MSU, and also to contribute to interdisciplinary programming at our institution. I do hope that over time we'll establish a bigger external profile, but right now it's internal. And the colloquium series was also very much an internal effort at University of Idaho. It was all about kind of changing the culture or influencing the culture in ways that were going to make people more excited about interdisciplinary activity. The philosophy conference and the toolbox are both external looking efforts, right? The philosophy conference and book series was all about philosophers outside of University of Idaho, outside of the Palouse. And the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, while we do a lot of work at MSU, it isn't limited by any means to MSU. We work internationally at this point. So I guess just thinking about how I might categorize these efforts that I've participated in, you know, there's some of them have really kind of concentrated on ensuring that the context in which I'm operating is a context that appreciates the work I'm doing, that values as much as I value, if possible, interdisciplinary activity. And the other part of the work is about kind of spreading the love, right? Getting the interdisciplinary interest out in the world and out both in among philosophers who I think should be more interdisciplinary than they are, and among others who are already engaged in really interesting interdisciplinary projects, but might need some process support of one kind or another. But I mean, I guess this is all just very much, revisionist history in a way, right? These do, they do kind of line up in this interesting pattern. But yeah, I'm not that thoughtful about my future to really have envisioned this kind of thing going back, 20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then my last question, I have lots of questions, but my last question that I'll share. I know that MSU, let me start over. Interdisciplinarity is a lot about, like you said, internally collaborating across disciplines, but there's the whole other world of, very related world of community engaged research and more like transdisciplinarity that not only crosses boundaries of disciplines, but crosses sectoral boundaries. And I'm wondering how you are navigating that with your new center, because in conversations here I'm having at University of Washington, there are lots of parallel efforts in interdisciplinary work and in community engaged work. And oftentimes people don't see each other in those two realms, but I think that they're super related.
Well, I probably should let Stephanie speak to this, because I have the very, very good fortune, as you know, of having Stephanie be.
Yes.
And so, thinking about how the center can both take advantage of community engaged work that's already being conducted and also contribute to that and develop new community engaged work has been a part of our thinking about the center from the start. I think, the big tent approach that I advocated, there being, kind of ecumenical about what counts as interdisciplinary, in part is a piece of advice designed to make sure that you don't exclude transdisciplinary efforts or projects. Like we're very excited about doing what we can to support transdisciplinary activity at MSU. So that's a mode of combination that we take very seriously and want to do what we can to facilitate. And so, the Big Ten approach allows us to see that as relevant, and then we have resources internally. Stephanie's an expert on these things, and so we're able to kind of, I think, imagine a way forward for the center that will allow it to be, contribute hopefully to an even greater degree of community engaged work at MSU. I think it's really important. What have you encountered at University of Washington? Is there resistance, or are there obstacles that you're confronting that you need to overcome?
Oh, great question. So the obstacles, University of Washington is generally quite open to the idea of both interdisciplinarity and community engaged research. It's very decentralized, so there are lots and lots of efforts. Mm-hmm. And in my work with, we're developing a group of, a consortium of collaborators who runs interdisciplinary centers. And we're trying to understand what are the best practices on campus. And in my work now with trying to apply for the Carnegie Community Engaged Campus classification, which is coming up next year.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's an exciting process, but I think one of the challenges will be the big tent approach of both helping people see themselves in either collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration, mm-hmm. or mm-hmm. community engagement without feeling like they're getting their toe stepped on for the work that they're already doing. So I'm involved in a project at the faculty senate level to develop more resources for interdisciplinary collaboration. And there are lots of people who are already doing this work and figuring out how do we get them engaged in a way that they feel excited and invested, and not just that it's extra work, or that their work is going to be taken, that we take credit for their work.
Yeah, right.
And then specifically with community engagement but in relation to collaboration, that's almost a cultural conversation too, of like, how do you see these two as different, and how do you see them as the same? Because I think that we can develop, for example, a center like you're developing that could support both, but that's a whole other conversation in and of itself.
Fantastic that you're doing that. I agree. I mean, what I know about University of Washington suggests that it would be a place that would be conducive to doing pretty high level interdisciplinary work. But I guess one just reaction, what we're trying to do with the center here is kind of create partnerships with people who are willing to give some of their valuable time to us, either in the form of attending a colloquium talk, or maybe helping us with a graduate training program or something like this, in return for value that we can add to their efforts, to their enterprises. So one of the things that we're doing this semester is trying to have as many conversations with people as we can, deans and others, and not asking for things, but instead offering our support, offering to help them do what they do better. And I think those who are interdisciplinary integrators, or who want to be interdisciplinary integrators, transdisciplinary integrators professionally, are in I think an especially good position to help create connections, and so offering to provide that kind of support for people. It seems kind of obvious to those of us who are kind of predisposed to think about them, but it's I found there a lot of relief on the faces of people who I've talked to, and where I've offered to help them do something, or help make a connection, or just help them support their programs. I think that you can get, at least if our experience is a teacher, it seems to me that kind of approach can help to create new ties and strengthen older ties in ways that might make it easier for you to get people to sign on to community engagement research projects, who without seeing that as a drawdown in their ability to do the things that really matter to them.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you.
And Stephanie, one of the things that Stephanie's doing also kind of along these lines is going out to community partners and asking for their input. So this goes back to that point that I made about expanding the network out to include the community, right? So I think it can be real easy for academics to forget that the community even exists. I mean, the community outside of your professional network even exists, and so these types of projects represent real opportunities to get the community involved, and to get their input and have them be real full-fledged participants in the work that you're doing.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So are there any more comments or questions from the group? As we're about ticking up to the 1 o'clock hour here.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Well, thanks, everybody. Let me go ahead and give an announcement, and then if someone thinks of something, that would be great. And if Michael, you want to have a few more words, let me just have this to say. We don't have the next webinar scheduled. We'll let you know when we do. In the meantime, I have a short to-do list for people. And that is, if you've missed any of our previous webinars, visit intereach.org and check them out. If you have a friend or colleague that you think would be interested in joining the Intereach listserv, encourage them to go to our site, intereach.org, and join us in the upper right. The other thing is to respond to the feedback form that will come into your email. And part of the feedback form asks for suggestions about future webinars. And my final word would be have a safe and happy holiday season, but I'd like anybody who has a comment or for Michael, if you have a few words for us, to go ahead and jump in.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for spending the lunch hour listening, and I hope that this was helpful. It certainly was helpful for me to have an opportunity to kind of reflect back on these efforts. As I mentioned in response to Jennifer, that much of my career has just been kind of a happy accident. But it is nice to try to think about the kinds of lessons I've had an opportunity to learn from my collaborators over the years, and so I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
Hey Karen, this is Pip Veazey. Michael, thank you for today. It was a great hour, and it was my breakfast hour, so I shared my breakfast.
This is great. Yes.
Good.
And I may follow up because I have a couple of questions about vision.